Out of the Attic on 91 FM has all of your favorite old-time songs in one place. Hear music from Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby, Dinah Shore, and many more. Join Nathan Randall from 6 to 8 p.m. for an evening drive down memory lane, only on 91 FM.
One of the conspiracy theories, whatever you want to call it, was that there was, I guess, foul play on the airplane. And
Boy, it took you a long time to get to this.
Yeah, it did.
I figured you just jump right in. Come on.
Well, you know, I gotta make sure I've got at least something recorded before you hang up on me.
Yeah, I told you, you can ask anything. I'm not hanging up on anybody. All my bills are paid. Hell, I ain't running from nobody. Go ahead.
So there is a theory that there was foul play involving a gun on board.
Mm-hmm.
And I read that a few years ago you had checked into it a little more in detail.
Mm-hmm.
And,
a lot more detail. Yeah.
Right. And if it didn't, say, involve your dad, is there a possibility that it still involved someone else?
Well, there's always a possibility. You know, I think maybe what you're getting at, there was a few years before my mother passed in 2004, I was approached, matter of fact, by the gentleman whose dad owned the radio station that my father worked at, and he wanted to exhume my father at the time and move him to another part of the cemetery where he was buried, so that they could put a monument up, because where he was buried, everything was flat to the ground. They wouldn't allow a monument. And, of course, he said, would you talk to your mother? I said, well, I'll talk to her, but I'll tell you what she's going to say already, you know. And Mother could talk like a sailor when she wanted to, and she did. And she said, you know, I buried your father once, and I don't want to bury him again. And she says, when I'm dead and gone, I don't care what you do. And that wasn't the exact language she used, but that's the gist of it. A few years after Mother passed, in 2004, I was approached again in 2006. Of course, this time now we had Mother and Father buried next to one another. And I had some half-siblings that they had to approve of Mother being moved, and along with me. And so they agreed to do it, and I agreed to do it, and we moved them. And I thought, because there's not a pamphlet out there, you know, what do you do when your father's been buried 48 years? And you know, what do you do next? What's step one? What's step two? And you know, there's no, like I say, there's no instructions or pamphlets or anything to go by. I guess it's like having a kid. You know, you just, you know, you just go with the flow. And what happened when Dad, you know, when we started talking about exhuming my father, I had a lot of thoughts go through my mind. Now there were a lot of people that, you know, made up some crazy things, and those shock jocks on the radio that I had to set straight, because a lot of people didn't get it and didn't understand it. And I understand why, because they weren't told the truth. They weren't told the whole story. And what, oh, see, there we go, real life again. But, you know, people just, you know, they only knew what they, you know, what they were told. So out of ignorance, you know, a lot of things were said. And then, like I say, none of that, it doesn't bother me, because I know what the truth is. And what bothered me was that these people weren't given the opportunity to make an informed opinion based on the facts. And the facts were that when we started talking about exhuming my father, I just started thinking, you know, what do we do here? What do we do next? And I contacted Dr. Bill Bass, who's one of the world's leading, and still is. He's an elderly gentleman. Obviously now retired from University of Tennessee, has started the Body Forum up there. Expert witness, people have probably seen him on TV 100 times, a forensic anthropologist. And he agreed to come down and examine my father's remains. When we did that, and like I say, you don't know what you're going to do. He said, are you going to be in there with me when I do that? I said, well, you wouldn't be doing it if I wasn't. And how I was going to handle that, I didn't know. You know, you have no idea, you know, what's going to happen. It was one of the most wonderful days of my life. When I opened the casket, my father it was my dad. He was totally preserved. It was no different than going to a wake. I mean, he was just the crease was still in his pants. I mean, everything was just, his hair was still standing up, his flat top. It was beautiful. It was wonderful. I got to see my dad, someone I'd never known. And then I thought, you know, there's two parts to this. You know, there's the part for my family, for us to know if my father had been shot, because there's no rumor of a gun. There was a gun. That's not a rumor. Buddy had a gun. Buddy Holly had a gun on board that plane. Matter of fact, Tommy Alsop, if you want to talk to him, will tell you he gave it to him the summer before, I believe. So there was a gun on board. So I just wanted to be sure that my father, I thought I was doing two things here. First, we were able to know, did my father die the way they said he died? And I would have never exhumed my dad for that purpose. But I thought, well, he's above ground. It would be kind of stupid not to do it, because not only for my family, but for history in general. Because as you just said, these theories and that kind of thing. Well, the theory I can put to rest are that, my father was not shot. That's what I can tell you, to get back to your original question. I don't know about anybody else. I can tell you my father was not shot. I can also tell your listeners and you that you can go back through and go through the Mason City Gazette and find an article where the sheriff, Jerry Allen, interviews the farmer who says his name was Albert Jewell, and the reason these things persisted, these rumors about being shot, or if they are rumors, was because the farmer said he found the gun. What had happened was they'd gone out when they did the original investigation, and they had made it clear that, look, the snow melts and you go to turn in your fields, we haven't found this, and this. And the families say that they had these with them. If you find them, please give us a call. Well, he found the gun. He found my dad's watch. He found Buddy's glasses. He found some dice that belonged to my dad. He found a number of items. But what he said he did was that he shot the gun 3 times to see if it worked. And this is in a newspaper article from back then, and with an interview with Sheriff Jerry Allen. And what happened was and that was about, 6 or 8 weeks after the crash, just give or take a few weeks. And the report on the air crash did not come out until September or October, as I recall it, that year. And nowhere in that report, even though they found this gun that the farmer said he shot 3 times, nowhere in this report do they mention a gun. Now, you put the 3 biggest stars you can think of on an airplane today, the plane goes down, they bury everybody, 6 weeks later they find a gun. You tell me they're not going to exhume those bodies and do an examination? Because they would. Back then, rock and roll, it didn't matter. It was just rock and roll. And it's my opinion. I know you can go back and read and see what rock and roll and what happened to Alan Freed and because of rock and roll. And I think maybe that had something to do with it. But that's the reason that all this, in my opinion, persisted, is because the Civil Aeronautics Board could have lied in their report and say, yeah, we looked into this, the gun had nothing to do with it, end of story. But they didn't do that. They didn't mention it. So what are people to think? If they don't even mention it, it's going to leave it open to speculation. And that's what they did. By thinking, by not mentioning it, thinking they were doing something, they were actually, doing the right thing. They were actually doing the wrong thing. And that's why here we are 53 years later and talking about it, where they could have, for the most part, put it to rest then. And whoever in charge or whoever's idea it was, they chose not to do that. That's not in the report at all.
Is there anything else that you would like to add?
No, just keep rocking. Don't let, the things we talked about here, I hope people understand. And there was another thing, too, because my father's casket is in a museum here in Texas called the Texas Musicians Museum. It's done in such a way. Elvis had sent, a nice floral arrangement, and Colonel Parker and some other people. And what they did is recreated that, and they recreated this, my father lying in state. He was in a closed casket, and it's a beautiful exhibit. And to me, because people say, well, that's kind of eerie and that's kind of creepy. Well, is King Tut's tomb creepy? There's all this stuff we're digging up people 5,000 years ago, the kings and this, that, and the other. Just because it happened, it's part of history. And when people think of the day the music died, and whenever rock and roll's talked about, and they're always going to go back to the 50s, if this earth is here 1,000 years or 5,000 years from now, that is just a piece that casket is going to make people talk. It's going to, because that's all I plan to do with it, and it was just donated to them to exhibit it. I want people to keep talking about rock and roll. Nothing I did, in my opinion, was creepy at all. It It was something that should have been done. I mean, because of the circumstances, because we had a dad above ground, needed to be done. It would have just been irresponsible of me, I think, not to do it. Because now history knows. History doesn't. These questions you're asking me now about Dad, they really don't have to be asked. The answers are there. We answered those. As far as Buddy, Richie, Roger, I can't speak to that. And I don't blame their families for not exhuming them, because I would have never done that with Dad. Like I say, it was just the opportunity presented itself. The thing people need to remember, though, is the music. It's all about the music, and it should always be about the music. Those things happen that we did, and they're going to continue to happen, and people are going to tell stories. Everybody remembers. People tell so many, the lies so long that they believe them, and and that's going to happen with more people than one, without naming anybody. But just as long as you remember the music and remember the roots of rock and roll, and just know that whenever you go back, these were the guys that were out freezing their butts off in old school buses with no heat, burning paper literally in baskets, trash baskets on the bus to try to stay warm. The drummer got frostbite, Carl Bunch. Those are the things you need to remember if you're into music, and it's these guys, not just Dad, but all the musicians of that era that were out there busting their butts, and people thinking, boy, these big shots had it made. No, it's nothing like today. These guys actually worked. Today they do play music. Back then they worked their ass off, and then they played music. But I think that's what people need to remember, that all the music they get today in the rock and roll form and pop form, they can always trace it back to these guys that gave it their all and really went above and beyond to see that the music was out there and people heard the music.
Well, I thank you very much, JP, for talking with me today and setting something straight, and informing the listeners about the show, and a lot that your dad and the Big Bopper, being the two different people, had to do with the start of rock and roll, and up until that fateful February day, and then also some of just this last little bit we talked about.
Well, it is what it is, and I tell people, I get it so much, where people will, say, "Oh, it's just so sad you never knew your dad," and I try to say, look, I'm one of the lucky ones. There's a lot of kids that never knew their dad, their mom, their dad, whoever. I'm fortunate my father did what he did, because I'm able to get out and I meet people and I hear stories and I receive things still today. Just in the last few weeks, where someone's come up and given me something that meant a whole lot to them that they had kept from the 50s to do with my father. And where, if your dad was an accountant or worked for the garbage company or was a roofer or whatever, that it's no different than my father being a musician. It's still your father. And all I ever wanted to know was my father. All I wanted to know is where I came from. And I think anybody that in my position, you want to know where you come from. You want to know what your roots are. Am I like my dad? Did he do this? Do I do the same thing like he did? That's all it was about. And then it turned into this, which is something I could have never, ever would have imagined. And like I say, here we are talking 53 years later, and I probably ought to be out in the back cutting the grass and and doing some of those things instead of talking on the radio and doing an interview right now. And I wish I hadn't said that, because I just looked outside and it looks like it needs cutting. So, so we know what JP's doing this afternoon. So no, I appreciate it. And like I say, man, anytime you want to talk about Dad, I don't know a whole lot about the other guys, basically, other than what I've read, and I've had a few inside because of people that knew people. My expertise, if I have any, is Dad.
That's JP Richardson Jr., the son of the legendary Big Bopper, one of his big hits, Chantilly Lace, and you can always check out of the Attic's other interviews here on YouTube. And don't forget to tune into Out of the Attic on WSUP.org, Monday nights from 6 to 8 p.m. Central Time.